The morning sun streamed through the tall glass windows of Lambert International Airport as Eliza Washington checked her watch. She was right on time for her flight to New York, where she was set to lead a presentation for her company's biggest client. As the marketing director for a top advertising firm, Eliza was used to these business trips, but that didn't make the early mornings any easier. She adjusted her navy blazer and wheeled her expensive carry-on suitcase toward the priority check-in line. Her husband had insisted on getting her the premium membership last Christmas. "You work too hard to be standing in those long lines," he'd told her with that smile that still made her heart skip after 15 years of marriage. The priority line was nearly empty, just two businessmen tapping on their phones. Eliza reached for her boarding pass on her phone, ready to show it to the attendant, when a voice cut through the quiet morning bustle. "Excuse me, ma'am. That line is for priority members only." Eliza looked up to see a security officer walking toward her, his hand already motioning toward the regular check-in line that stretched halfway across the terminal. Officer Richard Baker had been working at the airport for 12 years and had developed certain expectations about who belonged where. "Yes, I know," Eliza said with a polite smile. "I have a first-class ticket and platinum membership." She held up her phone to show him. The officer didn't even glance at her screen. "I'm going to need you to move to the general line." His voice was louder now, drawing the attention of nearby travelers. "This area is reserved for our priority customers." Eliza took a deep breath. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and she knew from experience that keeping calm was important. "I understand, but I am a priority customer. If you could just look at my boarding pass." "Look, lady," Officer Baker interrupted, his patience visibly thinning. "I don't have time for this. People need to know their place in the airport. The regular line is over there." He pointed again, his badge catching the light as he moved. A few people had stopped to watch. A young woman with glasses frowned and pulled out her phone, angling it toward them. Another passenger shook his head disapprovingly, though it wasn't clear at whom. "My place," Eliza repeated slowly, "is in this line, with my first-class ticket and platinum membership." She stood her ground, though her heart was pounding. She wasn't going to be pushed around, not today, not anymore. The officer stepped closer. "Don't make me call for backup. You're holding up the line." Eliza looked behind her at the empty space and then at the two businessmen who were now watching the scene unfold with uncomfortable expressions. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," she said firmly. "Of course you would." Officer Baker rolled his eyes. "You people always want to speak to the supervisor when you don't get your way." The thinly veiled insult hung in the air. A nearby airline employee, a young man with a worried expression, had begun to approach but seemed unsure whether to intervene. Eliza felt her cheeks burn, not from embarrassment but from anger. She straightened her back and looked the officer directly in the eyes. "By you people, who exactly do you mean, Officer Baker?" she asked, her voice steady as she read his name badge. The officer faltered for just a moment before doubling down. "People who think the rules don't apply to them. Now please move to the correct line, or I'll have to escort you there." Eliza pulled out her phone again, but this time she wasn't looking for her boarding pass. She dialed a number she knew by heart. "Who are you calling?" the officer demanded. "My husband," Eliza replied calmly. "He might be able to clear up this misunderstanding." "Your husband can't help you skip the line," Officer Baker scoffed. Eliza allowed herself a small smile as the phone began to ring. "We'll see about that." Eliza kept her phone to her ear, her eyes never leaving Officer Baker's face. The ringing stopped, and a deep voice answered on the other end. "Hey, love. Everything okay? You should be boarding soon." The concern in her husband's voice was clear even through the speaker. "Well, I'm having a bit of trouble at the check-in," Eliza explained, her voice steady despite the tension buzzing around her. More travelers had stopped to watch the scene unfold. "There seems to be some confusion about whether I belong in the priority line." Officer Baker crossed his arms, shifting his weight impatiently. The young airline employee who had been hovering nearby finally stepped forward. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his name tag reading Thomas. Before Officer Baker could respond, Eliza turned slightly toward Thomas. "This officer believes I'm in the wrong line and has refused to look at my boarding pass or membership information." Thomas reached out his hand. "May I see your boarding pass, ma'am?" Eliza showed him her phone screen. Thomas's eyes widened slightly. Mrs. Washington, you're absolutely in the correct line. In fact, as a Platinum member, you have access to our exclusive lounge as well. He turned to Officer Baker. Sir, this passenger is one of our most valued customers. Officer Baker's jaw tightened. ID can be faked. And why wouldn't she just say who her husband was right away if he's so important? On the phone, Eliza's husband's voice grew sharper. Who is that, Eliza? Put me on speaker. Eliza tapped the speaker button. You're on speaker now, honey. Who am I speaking with? Her husband asked, his tone professional, but with an edge that made Officer Baker straighten up. Officer Richard Baker, Airport Security, he replied, trying to maintain his authority. Officer Baker, my name is David Washington. I believe you're currently speaking to my wife, who is indeed a Platinum member and first-class passenger on today's flight to New York. The name landed like a stone in still water. Thomas's face paled. A few gasps came from the growing crowd of onlookers. Washington? As in Washington Airlines? Officer Baker asked, his voice suddenly much quieter. The very same, David confirmed. Now, would you mind explaining why my wife is being harassed while trying to check in for her flight? Officer Baker swallowed hard. Sir, there was no harassment. I was simply ensuring that passengers use the appropriate lines. By refusing to check her credentials and making assumptions about where she belongs. David interrupted. Thomas, is it? Could you please call Gerard and have him come to the check-in area immediately? Thomas nodded quickly. Yes, Mr. Washington, right away. He hurried off, speaking urgently into his radio. Officer Baker's face had lost its confidence. Mr. Washington, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I believe the misunderstanding is yours, Officer Baker, David said firmly. My wife deserves the same respect as any other passenger, regardless of who she's married to. The fact that you made assumptions based on her appearance is deeply troubling. A tall man in an impeccable suit was now hurrying across the terminal floor. The airport manager, Jared Phillips, arrived breathless at the scene, already apologizing before he'd fully stopped walking. Mrs. Washington, please accept our deepest apologies for this incident, he said, shooting a stern glance at Officer Baker. Your check-in will be processed immediately, and I'll personally escort you to the lounge. Eliza shook her head slowly. Thank you, Gerard, but I'd like to address what happened here first. She turned to face Officer Baker, who was now looking at anywhere but her face. Officer Baker, she said, her voice clear enough for everyone to hear, I don't want you fired. I don't want to make a scene, but I do want you to understand something. She paused, making sure she had his attention. This isn't about who my husband is or what airline we own. This is about basic human dignity and respect. The crowd around them had grown silent, hanging on her every word. I showed you my boarding pass. I explained my situation calmly, and you still chose to dismiss me based on nothing but what you saw when you looked at me. Eliza's voice didn't waver. So now I have one question for you, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Officer Baker finally met her gaze. What did you see when you looked at me that made you so certain I didn't belong? The terminal fell silent as Officer Baker stared at Eliza, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that everyone watching understood all too well. I was just doing my job, he finally mumbled, his eyes dropping to the floor. Your job is to ensure airport safety, not to decide who belongs where based on how they look. David's voice came firmly through the phone speaker. Gerard, I'm heading to the airport now. I'd like to meet with your security team when I arrive. Of course, Mr. Washington, Gerard nodded, dabbing sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. I'll gather everyone immediately. A woman from the crowd stepped forward, phone in hand. I recorded the whole thing, she said, addressing Eliza. If you need it for any reason. Thank you, Eliza replied with a grateful nod. I appreciate that. By now, several passengers had their phones out, some recording, others typing furiously on social media. The hashtag Washington Airlines was already trending locally. Mrs. Washington, Thomas spoke up nervously, your check-in is complete. Would you like to proceed to the lounge while we sort this out? Eliza glanced at her watch. Her flight wouldn't leave for another hour. Actually, I think I'll wait for my husband, she decided. He seems to be on his way already. Officer Baker's supervisor, a stern woman named Patricia, rushed onto the scene, her face tight with concern as she took in the situation. "Richard, what's going on here?" she demanded, eyes darting between the officer and the growing crowd. "There's been an incident involving Mrs. Washington," Gerard explained quietly to Patricia, emphasizing the name with a meaningful look. Patricia's eyes widened in recognition. "Mrs. Washington, please accept our sincerest apologies for any inconvenience. Officer Baker will be dealt with appropriately, I assure you. Everyone's very quick to apologize now that they know who I'm married to," Eliza observed, her voice tinged with sadness rather than anger. "But what about all the other people who don't have famous last names? Who speaks up for them when they're mistreated?" Thomas, who had been listening intently, cleared his throat. "I should have stepped in sooner," he admitted. "I saw what was happening and hesitated. That's on me, and I'm truly sorry." Eliza gave him a small smile of acknowledgement. At least his apology felt genuine. 20 minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up outside the main terminal. David Washington, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes behind designer glasses, strode purposefully through the doors. Despite his obvious wealth, there was something approachable about him, perhaps the slight wrinkles around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. The crowd parted as he approached. Eliza moved toward him, and they embraced briefly before turning to face Gerard, Patricia, and a thoroughly uncomfortable Officer Baker. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Eliza said to her husband. "Of course," David replied, giving her hand a squeeze before addressing the airport staff. "I understand there was an incident involving my wife and one of your security officers." Patricia stepped forward. "Mr. Washington, we deeply regret what happened. Officer Baker has been temporarily suspended pending a full investigation and—" David held up his hand. "I'm sure that's your standard procedure, but I'm not interested in punitive measures alone. What happened today is symptomatic of a larger problem." He turned to Officer Baker, who seemed to be trying to make himself as small as possible. "Officer, may I ask how long you've worked in airport security?" 12 years, sir," Baker answered, his voice barely audible. "And in those 12 years, have you received any training specifically addressing unconscious bias?" Baker hesitated. "We had a 1-hour video during orientation." David nodded thoughtfully. 1 hour in 12 years. He turned to Gerard. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident. This is about systems that allow these incidents to happen again and again." Gerard shifted uncomfortably. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Washington?" David looked at Eliza, who nodded encouragingly. They had discussed this possibility before, the chance to make real change if the opportunity ever presented itself. "I'm suggesting," David said, his voice carrying through the now quiet terminal, "that Washington Airlines partner with your security team to develop a comprehensive training program. Not just a 1-hour video, but ongoing education that addresses the real human impact of bias." He glanced at Officer Baker. "And I'd like Officer Baker to be part of developing that program." Baker's head snapped up, confusion written across his face. "Me? But under one woe." "Yes, you," Eliza confirmed. "Because change doesn't happen by pushing people away. It happens by bringing them in and showing them a different way forward." The next morning, Eliza sat at her hotel desk, scrolling through her phone. The incident had blown up overnight. Video clips were everywhere, with millions of views and thousands of comments. Some news outlets had already picked up the story. Airline owner's wife racially profiled at their own airport. She sighed and set the phone down. This wasn't how she'd wanted to spend her business trip. Her presentation was in 3 hours and she needed to focus, but the constant buzzing of notifications made that nearly impossible. Her phone rang. It was David. "How are you holding up?" he asked when she answered. "I've been better," Eliza admitted. "It's everywhere, David. I can't even check my email without seeing it." "I know. The board called an emergency meeting this morning. They're worried about stock prices." Eliza shook her head. "Of course they are. Never mind that a human being was humiliated. Heaven forbid the shareholders lose a penny." "Actually," David said, his voice lightening, "they've unanimously approved our training program proposal. Full funding, no questions asked." Amazing how quickly things can happen when money's on the line. Despite everything, Eliza smiled. So something good might come of this after all. Speaking of which, David continued, Officer Baker called the office this morning. Eliza sat up straighter. What did he want? To apologize, properly this time, and to say he's willing to help with the training program if the offer still stands. Eliza thought about it. The easy thing would be to let Baker fade away, become yesterday's news, but easy wasn't always right. Tell him yes, she decided, but make it clear this isn't about saving his job. It's about creating real change. After hanging up, Eliza tried again to review her presentation notes, but her mind kept wandering. A knock at the door provided a welcome distraction. Room service, called a voice. Eliza hadn't ordered anything, but when she opened the door, a young hotel employee stood there with a tray holding a steaming cup of coffee and a small envelope. Compliments of the hotel management, Mrs. Washington, the employee said with a nervous smile. And this came for you. Eliza thanked her and took the items inside. The coffee was prepared exactly how she liked it. Someone had done their homework. She opened the envelope and found a handwritten note from the hotel manager. Mrs. Washington, we were distressed to learn of your experience at the airport. Please know that our establishment values every guest equally. If there's anything we can do to make your stay more comfortable, don't hesitate to ask. Eliza set the note aside. Everyone was falling over themselves to be nice to her now. While she appreciated the gesture, it underscored a painful truth. Her treatment changed dramatically once people knew who she was married to. Her phone buzzed with another message. This one was from Thomas, the young airline employee who had eventually stepped in to help her. Mrs. Washington, I hope I'm not overstepping by contacting you directly. I wanted you to know that I've requested to be part of the training program Mr. Washington proposed. What happened yesterday showed me I need to do better. Thank you for turning this negative experience into an opportunity for growth. This message felt different, sincere, not prompted by fear or obligation. Eliza typed a quick reply thanking him for his honesty and courage. By the time Eliza arrived at her business meeting, she felt more centered. Her presentation went flawlessly, though she noticed some clients giving her curious glances. They'd seen the news too. During the lunch break, the company's CEO pulled her aside. That was quite a situation at the airport, he said. You handled it with remarkable grace. Thank you, Eliza replied simply. It got me thinking, he continued. We've been wanting to expand our diversity initiatives, but frankly, we've been dragging our feet. Watching that video was eye-opening. Would Washington Airlines be interested in consulting on our internal training as well? Eliza hadn't expected this. We're just getting our program off the ground, but I'd be happy to discuss possibilities. By the end of the business day, 3 more companies had approached her with similar requests. What had begun as a humiliating encounter was somehow transforming into a movement. Back at her hotel, Eliza found another envelope waiting. This one contained a letter from a mother whose 12-year-old daughter had witnessed the airport incident. My daughter asked me why that officer treated you that way, the letter read. It led to the most honest conversation we've ever had about race in America. Thank you for standing your ground with such dignity. You showed my daughter how to face injustice with strength and grace. Eliza's eyes welled with tears. She called David. I think we need to think bigger, she told him as soon as he answered. This isn't just about airport security anymore. People are ready for change, real change. What are you thinking? David asked. A foundation, Eliza said, the idea taking shape as she spoke, focused on education and training across industries, and I want to lead it. There was a brief pause before David replied, I think that's exactly what the world needs right now. 3 weeks later, Eliza stood in the conference room at Washington Airlines headquarters, surrounded by flip charts, coffee cups, and a diverse group of people who'd been working non-stop since 8 a.m. The air buzzed with energy despite the long hours. Let's take 5, Eliza suggested, noticing the tired eyes around the table. We've made great progress today. As people stretched and reached for refreshments, Eliza stepped back to observe the team she'd assembled. There was Thomas, who'd been promoted to Customer Experience Manager, Patricia from Airport Security, 2 civil rights attorneys, a professor specializing in bias training, and, most surprisingly, Officer Richard Baker. Baker had changed in the past weeks. The defensive, rigid man from the airport had been replaced by someone quieter, more thoughtful. He sat slightly apart from the others, nursing a cup of coffee and studying the training materials they developed. Eliza walked over and sat beside him. "How are you holding up, Richard?" He glanced up, still uncomfortable meeting her eyes directly. "It's a lot to take in. I keep thinking about all the passengers I've approached over the years, wondering how many times I got it wrong." "That's actually a good place to be," Eliza said. "Uncomfortable, but aware." "My daughter won't stop talking about you," Baker admitted with a small smile. "She's 16, follows all the news about the foundation, says she wants to intern with you someday." "We'd be lucky to have her," Eliza replied sincerely. The conversation was interrupted as David entered the room, followed by a camera crew. The documentary about their foundation's creation was another unexpected development. A major streaming service had approached them within days of the incident going viral. "Everyone ready?" David asked, looking around the room. "The board members are gathering downstairs for the presentation." Nervous energy filled the room as people gathered their notes. This was the moment they'd been working toward, presenting their comprehensive training program to the Washington Airlines board before rolling it out company-wide. "Richard," Eliza said quietly as the others filed out, "are you sure you're ready for this part? You don't have to share your story if you're not comfortable." Baker straightened his tie. "I'm sure. If my experience helps change things, then some good comes from it." Downstairs, the boardroom fell silent as Eliza walked to the front. Behind her, a screen displayed the Foundation's new logo, a simple image of an airplane window with diverse faces looking through it, and the words "through different eyes" beneath. "Good afternoon," Eliza began, her voice steady. "3 weeks ago, I was humiliated at our own airport because someone made assumptions about me based on my appearance. Many would consider that a terrible day, and in many ways it was." She paused, looking around the room. "But terrible moments can become turning points when we choose to learn from them. Today, we're presenting more than just a training program. We're offering a new vision for how businesses can address bias at every level, from frontline staff to executive leadership." For the next hour, the team presented their work. Thomas explained the customer service component, the professor outlined the educational framework, and the attorneys detailed compliance measures. Then came Richard Baker's turn. Baker approached the podium slowly. He traded his security uniform for a simple suit, but still carried himself with the posture of someone used to authority. He cleared his throat. "My name is Richard Baker. 3 weeks ago, I was the officer who profiled Mrs. Washington." His voice wavered slightly. "I've been in security for 12 years, and I thought I was good at my job. I thought I could tell who belonged where with just a glance." He took a deep breath. "I was wrong. Not just about Mrs. Washington, but about the entire approach to my work. I've spent these weeks examining decisions I've made, people I've stopped, assumptions that guided my actions without me even realizing it." The room was completely silent. "This program isn't about making people feel guilty. It's about opening our eyes to patterns we might not even know we're following. It's about becoming better at serving all passengers, not just the ones who look like they belong in first class according to some picture in our heads." When the presentation concluded, the board voted unanimously to implement the program across all Washington Airlines operations. Beyond that, they committed resources to make the training available to other airlines and airport security teams nationwide. Outside the boardroom, a reporter caught up with Eliza. "Mrs. Washington, did you ever imagine that being profiled at the airport would lead to all this?" Eliza thought for a moment. "No, I didn't. But that's how change often happens. Not through careful planning, but through painful moments that force us to see what needs fixing." As the cameras rolled, Richard Baker approached Eliza and extended his hand. She took it, and the photographer captured the moment, not of perfect resolution, but of human beings taking the difficult first steps toward understanding. 6 months after the airport incident, Eliza stood at the back of a large hotel conference room, watching as Richard Baker led a training session for airport staff from across the country. The Through Different Eyes program had grown beyond anything she'd imagined, with requests coming in from transportation hubs nationwide. "The trick," Richard was saying to the attentive audience, "is to recognize that we all have blind spots. Every single one of us. The goal isn't to feel bad about that, it's to become aware of them. He clicked to the next slide showing the now famous photo of him and Eliza shaking hands outside the boardroom. This moment wasn't the end of my journey, it was just the beginning. Eliza smiled, remembering how nervous Richard had been before his first training session. Now he moved around the stage with confidence, his personal story becoming a powerful tool for change. After the session, as staff members lined up to speak with Richard, Eliza slipped out to take a phone call from David. "How did it go?" he asked. "Really well. Richard's a natural teacher," Eliza replied, finding a quiet corner in the busy hotel lobby. "How are things on your end?" "The international expansion is moving forward. Airlines in Europe and Asia want to implement the program. We're going to need more trainers." Eliza watched people bustling through the lobby, travelers from all walks of life. "You know who would be perfect?" "Thomas. He's been asking for more involvement." "Good call. I'll speak with him today." After hanging up, Eliza noticed a young black woman sitting alone at the hotel cafe, looking at her with uncertainty, as if trying to decide whether to approach. Eliza smiled encouragingly. The woman gathered her courage and walked over. "Excuse me, are you Eliza Washington?" "I am." Eliza confirmed. "I'm Vanessa. I work as a gate agent at O'Hare." She hesitated. "I just wanted to say thank you. Before your program, I had 3 incidents in 1 year where passengers questioned my authority or asked to speak to someone else. Since our airport implemented the training, it's happened only once in 6 months." Eliza was touched. "That's wonderful to hear. Though once is still once too many." "True," Vanessa agreed. "But it's progress, and the best part is that my supervisor actually backed me up this time." She glanced at her watch. "I'm sorry, I don't want to take up your time. I just wanted you to know you've made a difference." As Vanessa walked away, Eliza felt a familiar mix of emotions: pride in the progress, frustration that it was still needed, and determination to keep pushing forward. Later that afternoon, Eliza was scheduled to give the keynote address at the conference's main session. The ballroom was packed with airport staff, airline executives, and even government officials interested in the program. Backstage, David adjusted Eliza's microphone. "Nervous?" he asked. "A little," she admitted. "This is our biggest audience yet." "You've got this," he assured her. "Just speak from the heart, like always." As Eliza walked onto the stage, the applause was thunderous. She waited for it to die down before speaking. "Thank you all for being here today. 6 months ago, I was just a woman trying to catch a flight who happened to run into the wrong security officer on the wrong day." A gentle ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. But that moment revealed something important, not just about one officer's bias, but about systems that allowed that bias to go unchecked for years. She paused, looking out at the audience. "Some people have called what we're doing revolutionary, but it's not. It's actually quite simple. We're just asking people to pause before making assumptions, to question their first impressions, to consider that their view of the world might be limited by their own experiences." Eliza gestured to Richard Baker, who sat in the front row. Officer Baker could have become the villain in this story. Instead, he chose to become part of the solution. That takes real courage, to admit mistakes and commit to doing better. She clicked to display a series of statistics on the screen behind her. In the 6 airports where our program has been fully implemented, customer complaints about discriminatory treatment have decreased by 47%. Staff satisfaction has increased by 32%. These numbers matter, but the individual stories matter more. The staff member who feels valued, the passenger who feels respected, the supervisor who steps in before a situation escalates. Eliza moved away from the podium, speaking more intimately. "The truth is, what happened to me happens to people every day. The only difference is that most don't have the platform I was given to address it. Our foundation exists to amplify those voices and create spaces where everyone is treated with the same respect, regardless of appearance, accent, or name." From the back of the room, a reporter raised his hand during the queue and a session. "Mrs. Washington, some critics said your program is just a way for your husband's airline to improve its public image after a PR disaster. How do you respond to that?" The room tensed at the question's sharp edge. Eliza took a moment before answering. "If all we wanted was good PR, we could have issued an apology, fired Officer Baker, and moved on. That would have been easier and cheaper. She smiled slightly. Instead, we've invested millions in creating lasting change. I suppose everyone can decide for themselves which approach suggests sincere commitment. The applause that followed told her all she needed to know about where the room stood. 1 year to the day after the airport incident, Eliza Washington stood in the same terminal where it all began. The space had changed, not just in appearance, with its new signage about respect and inclusion, but in atmosphere. Staff moved with a different energy, more attentive to all passengers regardless of how they looked or dressed. Eliza checked her watch. The flight from Chicago would land any minute, bringing Richard Baker and his daughter Lily for the anniversary event. Richard had left his security job 6 months ago to work full-time with the foundation, traveling across the country to share his story. Mrs. Washington, a young airport employee, approached with a tablet. Everything's ready in the conference room. The press has started to arrive. Thank you, Anthony, Eliza said, recognizing the young man who'd completed their training program last month. Anthony hesitated. Can I ask you something? What made you decide to work with Officer Baker instead of against him? Most people would have wanted him fired. Eliza considered the question. Firing one officer wouldn't change the system. And Richard showed something rare, the willingness to learn and grow. She smiled. Plus, his story is much more powerful coming from him than from me. The arrivals board showed the Chicago flight had landed. 15 minutes later, Richard emerged from the gate area with a teenage girl whose bright eyes took in everything around her. Eliza, Richard called, waving. The stiffness that had marked their early interactions was long gone. They hugged briefly, and Richard turned to his daughter. This is Lily. She's been talking about meeting you for a year. Lily stepped forward confidently. Mrs. Washington, it's an honor. Your foundation's youth program at my school changed how we talk about these issues. The honor's mine, Eliza replied warmly. Your father tells me you have some ideas for expanding our teen education component. About 1 million, Lily admitted with a laugh. Well, I want to hear every one of them. But first, we have a press conference to get through. As they walked toward the conference room, Eliza noticed David waiting by the entrance, deep in conversation with the airport director. He looked up as they approached, his face lighting up. Richard, good to see you, David said, shaking his hand before turning to Lily. And you must be the famous Lily. Your father hasn't stopped talking about your social media campaign ideas. Lily blushed slightly. They're just thoughts. Sometimes the best changes start with just thoughts, David replied. Inside the conference room, cameras flashed as Eliza, David, Richard, and airport officials took their seats at the front table. The room was packed with journalists and industry representatives. The airport director spoke first, sharing impressive statistics about decreased complaints and improved customer satisfaction since implementing the Through Different Eyes program. Then David outlined the foundation's growth, now operating in 47 airports across 3 continents. When it was Eliza's turn to speak, she set aside her prepared remarks and instead picked up a letter from the stack in front of her. This is from a woman named Grace, she began. She writes, I've been flying for business for 15 years. As a black woman, I've been stopped, questioned, and doubted more times than I can count. Last month at Denver International, I was rushing to make a connection when a security officer approached me. My body tensed, ready for the usual confrontation. Instead, he simply asked if I needed directions, then wished me a good day. I nearly cried right there in the terminal. This small interaction, being treated like just another traveler, shouldn't feel revolutionary, but it did. Eliza set the letter down. We've received hundreds of stories like this one. Small moments that reflect big changes, but we also receive stories where nothing has changed at all. Our work is far from done. She nodded to Richard, who took over with his part of the presentation, sharing his journey from that first confrontation to becoming an advocate for change. I thought I was one of the good ones, he admitted to the silent room. I didn't use slurs. I had black friends. I never saw myself as part of the problem, but I had been trained, by society, by experience, by countless subtle messages, to make snap judgments based on appearance. Breaking that habit has been the hardest and most important work of my life. As Richard spoke, Eliza glanced at Lily, who watched her father with unmistakable pride. The girl caught Eliza's eye and smiled. In that moment, Eliza felt the full circle of their journey, from confrontation to collaboration, from anger to understanding. After the formal presentations, a reporter asked about the Foundation's future plans. "We're launching a scholarship program," David announced, "for students interested in careers in transportation who demonstrate commitment to equity and inclusion, and I'm pleased to share that Lily Baker will be serving on our youth advisory board." As cameras turned to capture Lily's surprised reaction, Eliza thought about how differently things might have gone if she'd simply demanded Richard's badge that day at the airport. The easy path of punishment instead of the harder road of transformation. Later, as the event wound down, Eliza found herself back at the exact spot where Richard had stopped her a year ago. The terminal continued its busy rhythm around her, travelers coming and going, lives intersecting briefly before continuing on separate paths. A young black girl walked past, pulling a small suitcase, her mother following close behind. An airport security officer nodded to them politely as they passed. Such a simple interaction, yet Eliza knew how recently it might have gone differently. Small changes, rippling outward. One conversation, one training session, one moment of recognition at a time.